We're here with Chris Novak, the Director of Cyber Threat and Intelligence at Verizon. Chris, welcome. Glad to have you.
Thanks, Jake. Pleasure to be here.
So Chris, there's so much going on in cybersecurity and state and local government. One of the huge trends that seems to just never go away is ransomware. Ransomware is still hitting the public sector hard, maybe harder than it should be. Tell me a little bit about how you're looking at the problem of ransomware and what you're saying to folks when they talk to you about how hard it is to fight against it.
Sure. Yeah, ransomware, it's one of those interesting things where we've been studying it for just years and years, right? If you've read our data breach investigations report, and little plug there, if you haven't, go check it out, verizon.com/DBIR. Got to give it a little plug. But we've talked about all the different trends that we've seen there, the ups and the downs. And unfortunately, it's been mostly up, and not meaning in a good way, meaning in a bad way. We see more and more of it every year. In fact, last year we saw more ransomware events than we saw in the prior 5 years combined. And a lot of it honestly boils down to being opportunistic attacks. So, I always kind of get back on my soapbox when I have the opportunity to talk about things like cyber hygiene. And a lot of what I think we can combat as it relates to ransomware ties back to some of the basic foundational fundamental elements of cybersecurity, things like cyber hygiene practices.
And when you think about cyber hygiene, when you think about all of those sort of fundamentals, right, basics that everyone needs to do to be secure, whether I'm securing my social media account or whether I'm a government trying to secure everything. What are some of the reasons to that folks are slow to embrace these tactics, and what can we be doing to help speed it up?
Sure. Yeah. So there's a number of things. I think, one is organizations sometimes are just hesitant to try new things, or you're going against the grain of the people that you have. The cyber talent market is really, really tough right now. Whenever I talk to somebody, I ask them, how they feel about it, and everyone will tell me they don't have enough people, or they don't have the right people. And a lot of what we see in terms of either the technology or the tools that are needed to really drive better kind of prevention and defense, in many cases that requires technology changes that an organization might not be ready for yet. And so if you don't also have the right people to implement and operate that technology, then what we'll see is sometimes organizations will back away from a much better security framework or operational technology than maybe they could or should have in place, just purely because maybe their people are resistant to making that change. And obviously, I don't want to throw it all on the people, but that's sometimes a big piece of it, because like I said, organizations are struggling to find those right people. So that's definitely one piece of the puzzle. And then obviously there's always things like budget and things like that, where, sometimes the cycle of which we see threat actors changing, the way that they're attacking organizations or what they're going after, obviously doesn't necessarily align with a security maturity schedule. You might have something on the roadmap to implement in 6 months, a year, 18 months, and maybe it needs to happen sooner. And so sometimes looking at the agility of how we adjust our security roadmaps are also an important component of making sure that we're staying ahead of some of those threat elements.
I think the roadmap point is so key, and I actually want to take it even back to we're talking about basics at the beginning there, that cyber hygiene.
Sure.
Before we go too far, what are some of those? What are some of the ones that folks are missing? What are the things that with no staff changes, no technology changes, what can state and local governments, what can higher education be doing right now to help bolster those cyber defenses?
Sure. Yeah, I'd say probably the least exciting, but probably one of the most important things is asset inventory. I always talk about asset inventory, and my view of it has always been and hasn't changed, is if we don't know what assets we have, how do we wrap security around it? How do we assure anybody else that we're doing things securely? And so, that's a first piece. Understand the assets, then understand, the applications and the data that overlays on top of or resides within those assets. Have things like a data flow diagram. Many of these things are not even necessarily things that require a tremendous amount of, capital or money infusions to do. In some cases, it's elbow grease. It's, you got to get in there, you got to do the difficult, but again, it's not sexy, and it's not necessarily always something where you can throw a cool blinky light at it and it'll solve all your problems. A lot of times, I see a lot of organizations say, look, I'll just go out and buy this tech, I'll plug it in, I'll turn it on, and it'll go around and figure all this out for me. most of the time the tech doesn't work quite as well as that might be advertised in that regard, and it's still going to require a fair bit of elbow grease to actually get the work done. So I really do encourage folks to do the asset inventory, the data flow diagrams. Then you can overlay more technology like DLP, or also another big thing that I see a lot of organizations needing is the areas around things like zero trust. You mentioned public sector. They were really probably the predominant thrust behind actually implementing zero trust. A lot of industry that has already started adopting it did it because they saw the government push in that direction and they thought that it was a brilliant idea. But now we see in some cases public sector is struggling to be able to keep up with some of its own recommendations in some of those areas.
One of the things that we talk about a lot, both in today's event, but also just across the board, is the idea of like a whole of state cybersecurity approach for things like state governments and local governments. And the key part of that is that collaboration, right? That
Sure.
that asset sharing, resource sharing and tool sharing across governmental boundaries and governmental lines. When we talk about sort of the basics, getting back to the basics for things like ransomware prevention and the fight against ransomware, what role does collaboration between governments and between higher education institutions and the states that they exist in, what role does that play in that sort of work?
I mean, honestly, I think collaboration is pivotal. I don't think you're going to be able to be successful if you're not collaborating with partners, whether it is other agencies, whether it's public-private partnership. We see a growing interest in doing that because, one of the things I always tell organizations is you may not be the first to see something coming at you. It's quite likely somebody else experienced it first, and you can learn from their experiences and prevent being the next, victim of that threat actor or the next victim of that malware or social engineering attack or something like that. But you need to be plugged into some kind of collaborative framework, whether it's a formal framework or patchwork of organizations coming together, or maybe it is, something technologically focused like a threat intelligence feed that you ingest into a tool that then can operationalize it. But I think the element of collaboration is really important there because the threat actors, we see they do this, right? They have various deep and dark web forums where they're sharing some of their exploitations, how they work, maybe even buying and selling them or trading them, and they're sharing information on potential victims, targets, enumeration. If we're not doing similar collaboration on our side, we're going to struggle in order to be able to actually defend against it.
So one of the things that was in the annual Verizon report that I know you plugged at the beginning is sort of the difference between sectors, right? So not all sectors are getting hit with ransomware at quite the severity level as the public sector, or if they're getting hit, maybe they're a little bit better at defending against it. What are some of the differences between those sectors? What are some lessons that the public sector, government, and education can take from what's working in other places?
Sure. Yeah. So I'd say one, the piece you mentioned earlier about collaboration, I think the private sector is doing that very well in a lot of areas. There's a lot of ISACs and honestly, the public sector has ISACs as well. But what I do see sometimes a struggle there is they're maybe not always necessarily as interested in integrating with those, or the other common feedback I hear is that people will feel like it's not always very, I don't know if I want to say bi-directional. People will feel like they'll enter into one of these relationships and they'll be expected to be the party that's always giving information, but they don't necessarily feel like they're always getting. And so as a result, sometimes organizations will back away because they feel like it's sometimes very one-sided. So, I always encourage organizations to kind of evaluate those kinds of relationships. And then also, the other element that I see here is the need to create a kind of ecosystem of partners. I mentioned earlier the fact that, the market is a really tough place right now for cybersecurity talent. And one of the things that I still see a lot of public sector and higher education really grasping onto is the notion of we do it ourselves. And, that is fantastic if you can, but the challenge that I see is everybody out there is competing for the same talent, which is very hard, makes it very expensive. And so what we're starting to see is a lot of the private sector where, some might argue are doing some of this a little better or maybe a little bit ahead. is they're recognizing that, hey, you know what, I'm going to lean on some of these partners. I might engage some kind of, services or managed services to be able to help fill in gaps or areas or help address some of these kind of hot button issues. If I can't get the talent, or I can't keep the talent or train the talent in the ways that I need in order to affect the outcomes I desire from a security perspective, right? If I can't get this technology stood up, if I can't respond, according to certain SLAs, it doesn't matter if I'm doing it myself if I'm failing on my KPIs. And so, one of the things I always encourage organizations to be looking at is, what, when it's this competitive of a market, that's where shared services and managed services, I think, are really beneficial to a lot of organizations, because they can lean on those resources they need only when they need them, as they need them. They can tie specific guaranteed outcomes to them, and they can make the challenge of finding the talent, retaining the talent, and training the talent someone else's job, and they can just basically get an outcome, which at the end of the day, that's typically what everybody wants. At the end of the day, it's the outcome that you're going to get measured on. You may get an attaboy for, how you got there if it was a really interesting or unique way, but probably that's going to get forgotten more quickly than just, hey, you met or exceeded the KPI or the way that you're being measured.
So, Chris, we've covered so much, and sort of to close this out, to wrap up our chat here, there's so much that we've talked about and that we haven't talked about, that cyber leaders need to be focusing on, and to sort of keep abreast of. And how are you recommending to folks that they prioritize, or set them up for success and make some decisions that results in real action and real results for the people that they represent?
Sure. Yeah. So, I mean, the first thing that I tell organizations to be looking at is some form of risk management framework or system. Because I think that, historically, cybersecurity has been very, I don't know if I want to say kind of techie focused. Everyone's been very interested and impressed with the advances in the technology, and that's fantastic. But generally speaking, what I find is where the rubber meets the road, where the decisions need to be made, where the headcount is allocated and the budget dollars are allocated, most of that stuff doesn't necessarily resonate. You need to be able to show, this is the risk, these are the requirements we face, these are the outcomes that could possibly come of it. And then how do you tie your security program back to that risk management framework? And I think that is really critical. And then the other thing also, I see a lot of organizations now starting to mature their way of looking at it, because the challenge with security, I draw a lot of parallels between security and healthcare. You can always do more, right? I can always eat a little healthier. I could always exercise a little more, but how do I know when is enough? Same thing with security. I could always add another person. I can always add more technology. I could always do more, but at what point do I feel like I've hit the right threshold for me? And so I also think gathering data, doing analytics, doing peer comparisons, and there's a lot of consultancies out there. We get tapped to do this a lot for organizations who want to say, look, we feel like we've done a lot, but we'd like to get some kind of baseline comparison to understand whether or not it's really enough, or have we gone overboard, right? Where are we in that realm? So I think those kinds of comparisons and assessments are also very valuable. And I think it's also important for everybody to keep in mind that security is a moving target. So you may be where you want to be today, or maybe you're even a little bit above, but recognize that the baseline or the objective is always going to be moving as threat actors continue to evolve. So you need to be reevaluating that. Whereas, you might be great today, tomorrow you might have some work to do.
Nice. Well, Chris, thank you so much for being here today. Thanks for sharing all your good thoughts with us.
Yeah, my pleasure. Always. Thanks.
And stay tuned for more from today's Cybersecurity Modernization Summit.